That night, sleep refused to come to Ethan Calderon. The ocean outside his bedroom window roared with restless insistence, waves crashing against the cliffs like accusations he couldn't silence. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment he had closed the camera feed, how instinct had overridden habit, how decency had risen faster than control. For years he had believed surveillance was neutrality, that watching was not acting. That knowledge alone carried no moral weight. Now he knew better. Because power without restraint wasn't protection, was danger. Down the hill, in a modest apartment overlooking a busy street, Maya sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The encounter replayed in her mind in fragments. His steady voice, his refusal to blame her, the way he had looked, not like a billionaire, but like a man genuinely ashamed. She had expected embarrassment, or dismissal, or worse, silence. Instead, she had been given honesty. And that unsettled her more than fear ever could. Maya had learned early that apologies from people with power were rare. Most authority figures hid behind policies, lawyers, or money. Ethan Calderon had done none of that. He had looked her in the eye and taken responsibility. That mattered. The next morning, the estate buzzed quietly as usual. Staff moved through routines perfected over years. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Word traveled fast in places like this. Not facts but impressions. Why was she upstairs yesterday? He never calls cleaning staff to his office. Must be favoritism. Or worse. Maya noticed it immediately. The glances. The pauses in conversation when she entered a room. The sudden politeness that felt sharpened, edged with curiosity. She kept her head down and worked. She always did. In Ethan's office, Rebecca, his executive assistant, stood reviewing schedules, but her eyes kept flicking toward him. She had known Ethan long enough to sense when something fundamental had shifted. You deleted the solarium camera, she said finally. Yes. That system cost. I know exactly what it cost, Ethan interrupted calmly. And I'd pay 10 times more to undo what it allowed. Rebecca studied him. This is about Maya. It's about respect. Rebecca nodded slowly. Then you should know the staff is talking. Ethan exhaled. He had anticipated this. Power never moved in isolation. Every action echoed. I don't want her punished for my failure, he said. Then you need to be careful, Rebecca replied. Not because you're wrong, but because people don't like when hierarchy bends. That afternoon, Maya was called into the administrative wing, not by Ethan but by Diana Klein. Diana was polished in the way magazines celebrated. Designer heels. Perfect posture. A smile that never reached her eyes. She managed internal compliance and loved rules the way others loved influence. Maya, Diana said sweetly, closing the office door. Please sit. Maya did. I want to make something very clear, Diana continued. This estate runs on professionalism. Boundaries. Appearances. Maya nodded. Of course. Mr. Calderon is generous. But generosity can be misinterpreted. I'd hate for your situation to be misunderstood. My situation? Maya asked calmly. Diana smiled tighter. You're new. People notice when new staff receive special attention. Maya felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. I didn't ask for attention. Diana leaned forward. Just remember your place. That word, place. It had followed Maya her entire life. She stood. With respect, I know exactly where I stand. And I take my work seriously. Diana's eyes hardened. So do we, she replied. See that it stays that way. Maya left the office with her dignity intact, but something else stirred beneath it. Resolve. That evening, Ethan stood alone in the solarium. The disabled camera stared blankly from the corner like a reminder carved in plastic and wire. He imagined how many times he had walked past moments like this. Moments where systems replaced conscience. Never again. He made another decision. One that would ripple far beyond a single room. He instructed Rebecca to initiate a full audit of the estate's surveillance policies. Employee privacy. Clear consent. Blind zones. Written safeguards. No exceptions. When Rebecca hesitated, Ethan met her gaze. If I expect loyalty, he said, I owe humanity. By the end of the week, the rumors reached their peak. Some said Maya was manipulating him. Others said she'd threatened legal action. A few whispered worse. And then Ethan Calderon did something no one expected. He called a full staff assembly. Standing before them, cleaners, managers, security, administrators, he spoke without notes. I failed, he said. The room froze. I allowed systems meant for protection to violate trust. That ends now. Eyes turned toward Maya. Ethan followed their gaze, and then did something that shattered every assumption in the room. This employee, he said, showed more integrity in one moment than most systems do in a lifetime. Silence. No one here will ever be judged by rumors again. Diana stiffened. Maya stood still, heart pounding. This is not favoritism, Ethan continued. This is accountability. The staff dispersed quietly. Some ashamed. Some thoughtful. Some angry. But the line had been drawn. And Maya realized something profound as she returned to her cart. This wasn't about a camera. This was about power choosing humility. And it terrified those who thrived without it. When power doesn't like being questioned. The room Ethan had addressed fell silent long after the staff dispersed. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the kind that settled into corners and waited. By the next morning, the Calderon estate functioned as it always had on the surface. Floors gleamed. Glass sparkled. Schedules were followed to the minute. But beneath that polished order, something brittle had formed. Respect had shifted. And resentment had taken its place. Maya felt it the moment she stepped into the east corridor. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Eyes lingered too long. Smiles appeared that didn't belong. She had been invisible before, another uniform moving quietly through wealth she would never touch. Now she was visible. And visibility, she had learned, came at a price. Diana Klein watched from the administrative office balcony as Maya cleaned the sculpture alcove below. Her jaw tightened. She had spent years positioning herself close to power, learning Ethan's preferences, mirroring his professionalism, staying useful but noticeable. And now a cleaner had disrupted the balance. Not by ambition. Not by seduction. But by integrity. Diana despised that most of all. By noon, the first formal complaint landed on Thomas's desk, the estate operations manager. It cited workflow inefficiencies in the guest wing. Vague. Untraceable. Pointed. Maya was called in. Someone says you missed protocol, Thomas said carefully, scanning the report. He was a fair man, but fairness often bowed under pressure. I followed the checklist exactly, Maya replied. You can review the logs. Thomas nodded. I will. The logs were perfect. The next day another complaint. Then another. Missing supplies. Delayed service. Improper access timing. None of it true. Maya began documenting everything. Timestamps, witnesses, procedures. She had learned long ago that quiet people survived by being prepared. Ethan noticed the tension immediately. She's being targeted, Rebecca said bluntly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, jaw set. Because I admitted fault. No, Rebecca corrected. Because you embarrass people who never expected accountability. That afternoon, Ethan called Maya to his office again. Not privately this time. Rebecca was present. So was Thomas. Maya stood tall, hands folded calmly in front of her. I need to ask you something, Ethan said. And you don't owe me an answer. She nodded. Do you want to leave? The question surprised everyone, including Maya. No, she said after a beat. I want to work. Even knowing it may get harder? She met his eyes. I've lived through harder. That answer stayed with Ethan long after she left. But Diana was already moving faster. She filed a formal report with the board's ethics liaison, an external oversight channel rarely used. The allegation wasn't explicit. It didn't need to be. Potential conflict of interest. Perceived power imbalance. Reputational risk. Language designed to wound without evidence. The board responded immediately. An inquiry was opened. By evening, business media had caught wind of it. Billionaire employer under scrutiny for staff relations. Power, privacy, and the Calderon estate. Ethan watched the headlines scroll across his monitors, feeling the familiar pressure of public judgment. He had weathered worse. But this time, someone else stood in the line of fire. Maya arrived at work the next morning to find a reporter waiting outside the gates. Are you involved with Mr. Calderon? Did he promise you money? Did you feel pressured? Security intervened quickly, but the damage lingered. Inside the estate, whispers grew louder. Some staff avoided her entirely. Others watched with fascination. A few offered quiet support. Mrs. Alvarez from laundry pressed a warm hand into Maya's and whispered, "Hold your head high." Maya smiled, but exhaustion tugged at her eyes. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, documents spread across the table. She reviewed her employment contract, the privacy disclosures, the audit notices Ethan had initiated. Then she opened a different folder. One she hadn't touched in years. Academic transcripts. Competition certificates. Research abstracts. A life she had paused but never abandoned. Maya Lin hadn't just studied design theory. She had worked on ethical architecture frameworks, privacy-first spatial planning, human-centered systems. The very issue now tearing the estate apart. She closed the folder slowly and made a decision. The next morning she requested a meeting. Not with Ethan. With the board. The liaison hesitated when the request came through. "She's just staff," someone said. Ethan overheard. "She's a stakeholder," he corrected coldly. "Schedule it." When Maya entered the boardroom, she wore the same uniform, but her posture was different. "Come. Prepared." She placed a binder on the table. "I'm not here to defend myself," she said. "I'm here to clarify the truth." The board members exchanged glances. She opened the binder. Inside were diagrams, policy analyses, independent recommendations, written not as an employee but as a professional. She spoke clearly, without accusation, without fear, about systems that forget humanity, about power that becomes blind, about accountability that must flow downward and upward. Silence filled the room. When she finished, one board member leaned forward. "Why are you cleaning houses?" Maya met his gaze evenly. "Because dignity isn't defined by job titles," she said. "And responsibility doesn't wait for permission." Outside the boardroom, Diana watched the door close. For the first time, uncertainty crept into her confidence. Because she realized something too late. This wasn't a scandal. It was a reckoning. And Maya Lin was no longer just surviving it. She was shaping it. The truth they never expected. The boardroom doors closed softly behind Maya Lin. Inside, the silence lingered long after her footsteps faded down the corridor. No one spoke at first. Not because they didn't know what to say, but because every assumption they had walked in with now felt dangerously exposed. Ethan Calderon remained standing at the far end of the room, arms folded, watching the faces of people who had advised him for years. People who prided themselves on foresight, on control. Maya had dismantled both without raising her voice. "She's articulate," one board member finally said, choosing his words carefully. "That's not the word you're looking for," Ethan replied. "She's right." The liaison cleared her throat. Her analysis aligns with emerging global standards. Human-centered surveillance design is gaining traction. And yet, another member added quietly, "We installed a system that ignored it." No one mentioned Diana Klein. But everyone thought of her. Across the estate, Diana sat rigidly at her desk, refreshing her email inbox. She had expected validation, support, quiet reinforcement of the narrative she had built so carefully. Instead, nothing. No response. No reassurance. Only silence. By midday, the inquiry shifted direction. Instead of questioning Ethan's character or Maya's integrity, the board requested internal correspondence. Complaint logs. Metadata trails. Patterns emerged quickly. Too quickly. Reports filed within minutes of one another. Identical phrasing. Repeated access timestamps. Thomas brought the findings to Ethan personally. "They're all coming from the same source," he said grimly. Ethan didn't need to ask who. That afternoon, Diana was called into the conference room. She walked in confident, but not calm. The liaison slid a printed report across the table. "Can you explain this?" Diana glanced down. Her face tightened. "I was only trying to protect the company," she said. "Perception matters." "So does truth," the liaison replied. "And manipulation carries consequences." Diana's voice sharpened. "You're choosing a cleaner over a senior administrator?" Ethan leaned forward slowly. "We're choosing integrity over entitlement." The words hit harder than any accusation. By evening, the internal memo went out. Diana Klein was suspended pending formal review. The estate buzzed, not with gossip this time but shock. Some staff felt relief. Others fear. Power had finally been questioned, and found wanting. Maya returned to her duties quietly, but something had changed. People met her eyes now. Some nodded. Some apologized without words. Mrs. Alvarez hugged her tightly in the hallway. "You stood," she whispered. "That's rare." News outlets picked up the story again, but the tone had shifted. Billionaire estate sets new privacy standards. Unexpected voice drives ethical reform. Accountability redefined at Calderon Estate. Maya's name wasn't mentioned publicly, but her influence was everywhere. Ethan watched the coverage from his office, reflecting on how close he'd come to letting fear dictate his response. For years he had believed strength meant silence. Maya had shown him otherwise. That night, he invited her to the terrace, not as an employer, not as a benefactor, but as a human being seeking conversation. They stood overlooking the ocean, the wind cool and steady. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan said softly. "You could have walked away." "I've walked away my whole life," Maya replied. "This time I stayed." Ethan nodded. "You changed more than policy." She looked at him. "So did you." Pause. "Not awkward. Honest." "I don't want you to feel indebted," he said carefully. Maya smiled faintly. "Good. Because I'm not." That was when Ethan realized the truth he hadn't allowed himself to see. She wasn't here because of him. She never had been. She was here because she belonged, long before anyone recognized it. The next morning, the board issued its final determination. No misconduct by Ethan Calderon. Full fault attributed to structural oversight and internal manipulation. And a recommendation. A new role. One that no one saw coming. Maya Lin was formally invited to lead the estate's Human Ethics and Privacy Advisory Initiative. Independent. Autonomous. Paid accordingly. The offer was delivered without ceremony. Without pressure. Maya read it slowly. Then closed the folder. "I'll accept," she said. "On one condition." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That this doesn't make me exceptional," she continued. "It makes the standard higher for everyone." Ethan smiled. For the first time in years, not as a billionaire, but as a man learning. When karma stops waiting. The announcement traveled faster than the ocean wind. By the end of the day, everyone at the Calderon estate knew. Not because of gossip this time, but because the power structure itself had changed. Maya Lin was no longer just staff. She was leadership. And that reality unsettled people who had built comfort on hierarchy. Diana Klein learned the truth from a company-wide email she was no longer allowed to reply to. Her suspension had been finalized. Her access revoked. Her carefully curated influence erased with a single line of text. She sat alone in her apartment, staring at the screen, replaying every moment she had dismissed Maya as insignificant. She had believed power flowed downward, that proximity to wealth equaled worth. Now she understood too late. Power had never belonged to her. It had simply tolerated her. At the estate, Maya's first day in her new role didn't look dramatic. There was no speech. No announcement ceremony. She arrived early wearing the same neutral colors she always had, but her walk was steadier, her presence unmistakable. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions no one else had thought to ask. Where blind spots existed. Where consent was assumed instead of granted. Where silence had been mistaken for agreement. Staff began approaching her, not out of obligation but relief. For the first time, someone was listening without judgment. Ethan watched from a distance, careful not to interfere. He had offered resources, authority, and independence, but he understood something now. Respect could not be managed. It had to be earned. Meanwhile, the board uncovered something else. The inquiry into Diana's actions revealed a deeper pattern, one that stretched back years. She hadn't just manipulated reports. She had buried complaints, redirected blame, protected certain managers while punishing others. All in the name of stability. The truth surfaced quietly but thoroughly. By the time Diana was called in for her final review, the outcome was already sealed. Her termination was immediate. No severance. No references. No soft landing. She protested. She blamed. She accused. But power no longer answered her voice. The story broke publicly days later. Senior administrator removed after ethics review. Retaliation and manipulation confirmed. Social media responded swiftly. Not with cruelty but clarity. People recognized the pattern. They always did. At the estate, the atmosphere shifted again, but this time lighter. Staff morale improved. Communication opened. Small injustices that had lingered for years were finally addressed. Maya didn't celebrate. She worked. Late one evening, Ethan found her in the solarium, now redesigned. Cameras removed. Privacy zones clearly marked. Transparency policies posted openly. "You changed this place," he said quietly. "We changed it," she corrected. Ethan nodded. There was something else he needed to tell her. Something he had never told anyone. They sat. He spoke. About the betrayal that had shaped him. About the partner who had stolen not just money, but trust. About the walls he had built and the cost of living behind them. "I thought control would protect me," he admitted. I didn't realize it was isolating me. Maya listened. When he finished, she said gently, "Control feels safe when trust has failed. But healing doesn't come from watching, it comes from choosing." Ethan swallowed. He realized then that this wasn't admiration he felt. It was gratitude. The board convened one final time. This time not to investigate but to commit. New industry standards were adopted. Policies drafted under Maya's guidance would be shared publicly. Calderon Industries pledged funding for ethical design research, scholarships included. Not named after Ethan. Named after principles. The press wanted interviews. Maya declined most. But she agreed to one on her terms. She stood before the camera calmly. "I wasn't elevated because I was wronged," she said. "I was heard because I was prepared." The interviewer paused. "What would you say to people who feel invisible?" Maya looked straight into the lens. "Your voice matters before it's acknowledged," she said. "Don't wait for permission to become who you already are." The clip went viral. Not because of scandal, but because of truth. That night, Ethan stood alone on the terrace, watching the lights below shimmer across the coastline. He realized something profound. The justice he had feared had actually freed him. Because letting go of control had given him something he hadn't felt in years. What remains when power learns to bow? The ocean was calm the morning Maya Lin arrived at the estate for the last time as an employee. The sky stretched wide and pale blue, the kind of morning that felt like an answer rather than a question. She paused at the gates, breathing in the salty air, remembering how nervous she had been the first day she pushed her cart through those doors. She hadn't come to clean. She hadn't come to consult. She had come to close a chapter, on her own terms. Inside, the Calderon estate no longer felt like a fortress. The changes were subtle but unmistakable. Privacy signage was clear. Doors once locked without explanation now carried purpose. Cameras existed only where protection was necessary, not where power could intrude. People moved differently too. They spoke openly. They greeted one another by name. They smiled without checking who was watching. Maya walked through the solarium, sunlight pouring freely through the glass ceiling. This room had once been the center of her fear, the place where vulnerability collided with authority. Now it stood as a symbol of reform. Ethan waited for her there. Not behind a desk. Not flanked by assistants. Just a man standing in quiet gratitude. "You don't have to go," he said softly. Maya smiled. "I know." They stood together looking out at the ocean. The board's offer had been generous, global advisory leadership, funding, influence. But Maya had surprised them again. She had declined permanence. Instead, she proposed something bigger. An independent institute. One that trained organizations in ethical design, privacy-first systems, and human-centered leadership. One that hired people overlooked by traditional power structures. One that turned lived experience into expertise. The board agreed. Ethan funded it without conditions. Not because he owned the idea, but because he believed in it. "I used to think legacy was something you built," Ethan said quietly. "Now I think it's something you leave behind intact." Maya nodded. "Or something you give away so others can build." They shared a moment of silence. No romance. No promises. Just mutual respect. Across the city, Diana Klein watched the news from a small apartment she hadn't expected to live in. Job applications unanswered. Invitations gone. Her name now attached to articles about retaliation and misuse of authority. For the first time, no one was listening to her explanations. And for the first time she understood what it felt like to be dismissed. But this story wasn't about her anymore. It never really had been. Weeks later, the institute opened its doors. Students, workers, designers, people who had been told they were just something, just staff, just support, just invisible. Maya stood before them, not elevated, not untouchable. Grounded. "I didn't get here because someone rescued me," she said. "I got here because I was ready when truth finally mattered." Ethan attended quietly, sitting in the back. No one announced him. No one needed to. As the crowd applauded, he realized something essential. This was the reward power never gave him. Witnessing growth he didn't control. Trust he didn't manage. Impact he didn't own. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan returned to his office one last time. He shut down the security wall. Not because it was obsolete, but because he no longer needed to watch everything to feel safe. He had learned something cameras never could teach. That dignity, once respected, multiplies. And Maya Lin walked forward, not as a symbol of justice but as proof of it.